You're listening to Investigation Insiders by Integris Intelligence.
Hello again, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Investigation Insiders. This is Forhad. Hope you are all doing well. Joining me today again is my trusted colleague and friend, Joe Morrow. How are you, Joe?
I'm doing great. How are you doing today?
I'm doing okay. Kind of a funny discussion that we had just before hopping on this call, huh? About me dragging you into these podcasts. It's so outside of what you thought you'd be doing. But I just wanted to say publicly that I'm so proud of the fact that you were willing to adjust and be flexible and try these things. And based on the feedback that we're getting, you're doing pretty good.
Thank you. You're making me blush.
Um, so as you all may have already picked up on, we're doing our best to sort of mix up the content on the show. In addition to entertainment value, we really want to put information out that people can actually learn from and use. So today we are going to discuss a topic that people should really listen carefully to. We've done, as you know, a lot of background checks over the years, and while the purpose, goals, specs have differed, one of the things that's always, almost always included, I should say, is criminal checks as part of almost every background check that we're doing. So Joe and I are going to get into what that means. Joe, why don't we start by talking about the different reasons for conducting criminal checks? Want to go over a few points, and one thing I want to say, as with all of our podcasts, we are not diving into every single detail. We're trying to give enough information to get the point across, but obviously there'll be some points that we may not discuss on this episode. So Joe, why don't you get into some of the reasons?
Sure. I mean, the most important reasons I believe that will affect your company and individually is because you want to proactively eliminate the potential for legal and operational problems. You want to reduce your company's liability. And for me, it all comes down to peace of mind. If you have peace of mind for yourself, your managers, your employees, you feel better moving forward in any venture. Of course,
Yeah,
painting a fuller picture of the person you run a criminal check on by a person or organization. You want that person to perform the record check. You want them to analyze, interpret the data, and you feel that security in your decision making moving forward.
yeah, absolutely. All fantastic points. And I think most people understand why that's important. Sometimes it's a little confusing as to, like, people waiting for an incident to occur to then go back and redo everything. But hopefully, as we get more information out there, as others get more information out there, people are more proactive about doing these, because it will do all the things that you mentioned. So when you were with the FBI and you were looking into someone's criminal past, how'd you do it?
The first place to go is the best place would be researching NCIC, which is the National Crime Information Center, which it actually is the definition, I should say, is a computerized index of criminal justice information, meaning that's where you'll find the criminal histories. You can see if somebody is a fugitive. You can search about stolen properties, weapons, missing persons, if there's a warrant on somebody, things of that nature.
Sure, sure. So I guess now that you have a little over a year in on the private side, what have you learned? What's been the biggest difference between how the government, or while you were with the FBI, worked and how it is in the private sector?
I see that because NCIC was like a true national search, it's a better starting point because you're able to work from top down, kind of. You get to access federal, state, and local level criminal histories and their records, which gives you a broader view. The private sector does not, most of the private sector, I should say, does not have access to the system. So they have to have a multi-layered approach to research going into individual local law enforcement agencies, and that's based on the other research they do.
Yep, no, that is without a doubt the biggest difference, I would think, without having experienced what you did with the FBI. And I think that's one of the sort of misconceptions about, like, when people come to us that don't necessarily know a lot about this. Sometimes even people that do, they think you could just sort of flip a switch, enter in like almost a social security number somewhere, and get everything you need. So
But
the
we know that's not the case.
that's absolutely not the case. So okay. So I mean, I think that's a good sort of baseline, because it helps us kind of understand the differences between the public and private sector. So I guess let's get into some of the specifics about the private sector.
Great. So I'm going to ask you now.
Mhm.
Can you provide a broad overview of how checks are conducted on the private side?
Sure. So as you mentioned, there is not there are databases, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but there is not a single place that we could go to get our answer. So the first step in performing a criminal background check is to determine some basic data about an individual. So what's their name, what are their aliases, what's their date of birth, and what is their geographic footprint.
So you mentioned geographic footprint. Why does that matter? What does that mean, really?
Yeah, so like again, it would be, you have to sort of take a reasonable approach to where you're going to search, because there's not a national database available to us. So what that means is checking applicable courts based on an individual's address history. So for example, if your address history showed that you lived in New York, California, and Florida, that's where we would conduct checks. It wouldn't make sense if you had no footprint to check Texas also, or Mississippi, or Alabama. So that's where the geographic footprint. Now, there again, we'll get into this a little bit later. There are some other searches that cast a wider net, but for the most part, this is the starting place.
Makes sense. So tell me, how do names and aliases factor into this equation?
So typically, criminal searches are done by exact name and date of birth. So if your name is Jane Smith, but your maiden name is Jane Doe, a search of Jane Smith will not reveal any records under Jane Doe. So this plays a factor in fees also, because performing a search under a second name is almost like doing a second person. In New York, for example, the total cost that we incur is $98 per name and DOB searched, the combination of the two. So before we even charge $1, the cost is almost $200 for the example I shared about Jane Doe and Jane Smith.
Got it. Can you tell me what an index search means?
Yeah, I'm actually glad you brought that up, because I think this is one of the misconceptions about what people think happens when a criminal search is done. Typically, a search is done either in person at the courthouse or online, where you search by name and date of birth. And what comes back is basic information about any cases that pop up. So, arrest date, case type, parties involved, disposition, that kind of information. You don't necessarily get the records associated with the case. So that's typically what's initially reported to the client, unless there's a reason to immediately dive further into it and pull court records and things like that. That's what's reported to the client. And then based on, their interpretation and understanding of the information we provide, they may ask us to go deeper into the case, pull court records, things like that, which again takes time and may cost additional money. So the index search is important because that's typically what you're getting back, is that basic information on the case.
Got it. That sounds good. So can you talk a little bit about the different searches that can be done? Like what type of information you would get back from each one?
Sure. And you sort of alluded to it already earlier when you were talking about NCIC and how you were able to get the different levels of courts, reporting into that. So let's start at the sort of basic level. So there are county level records, right? And there are state level records. Some states, like New York, has a very, very good state repository. So you could run a state search through the Office of Court Administration and get basically it would cover all of the counties in New York State. But other states, most states actually don't have a comprehensive up-to-date state repository. So typically in those places, you would run a county-wide search. And basically, that would pull information from upper courts, sometimes lower courts, but sometimes you'd even have to go, if you want to go deeper into that, there are lower level courts that you might have to search as well. So, I mean, there's a lot of layers there as it relates to state, county level crimes. Then there's obviously the federal criminal system, which typically is run through PACER, and that obviously involves federal crimes. Then there's the sex offender registry, which, there's both at the state level and there's a national sex offender registry, which you can run. There's global watch lists that are available through the subscription databases. There's the Department of Motor Vehicles, which again, sometimes there's information on there that may not be picked up in the other searches that you're doing. And then there is and this is named different things by different companies, but I guess the closest thing to a nationwide database for the private sector, where the subscription databases compile data. They buy information from different courts around the country. This is no information on the federal level, only on the state and county and local levels, where this is the closest thing, as I mentioned, to a nationwide search, where they buy data from different courts around the country, and you'd run a search by the person's name. And basically, where this helps is that sometimes it picks up criminal hits in areas that you may not look based on the address history of a person. So it's a very, very good search. Probably, I think they say it's somewhere between 50 and 60% of the courts around the country are reporting into it. So it's very useful and a good additional step to take, but certainly not a standalone if you want to be comprehensive. So those are generally the different searches that are done. And as you can tell, you mentioned the term multi-layer earlier, right? That's what this is. Each of these searches will hopefully give you a chance at getting the information you need, but no one search is all inclusive.
Yeah, that makes sense. I remember even working for the FBI, running NCIC checks. Not all the information was up to date, so you may have to dig deeper into the state and local records to see if they have anything more updated that's provided in NCIC at that point in time. So tell me, how long does it take to complete a criminal background check?
So again, another very, very common question, right? So usually it takes between 1 and 3 business days, right? But this can vary based on different factors. One of the factors is just mercy of court. There are certain courts around the country where you cannot do a search yourself. You actually have to submit a request to the court clerk, who then does the search and provides you with the results, right? And so if they're very, very busy, it could take a little bit longer. And if it's not very busy, you could get it very, very quickly. And during the pandemic, we learned how slow it can get because there were additional restrictions that were placed. So that's one of the factors that could delay it. Other things are like how far back in the record. So most people are, unless there's a specific reason to go further back, which oftentimes there are, a lot of people are looking at records for the past 7 or 10 years just to see more relevant, timely information about a person's past. And if you go beyond that, sometimes it could take longer because the records may be archived, they may be paper records. So things like that can also delay it. But again, generally 1 to 3 business days.
And now, the all-important question that I'm sure you've been asked many times: how much do criminal checks cost?
Again, you're absolutely right. I get asked this question all the time, and it really depends on how comprehensive you want to get, and not every person is the same, right? So go back to an example of someone who's lived in one location their entire life. They've never traveled anywhere. They've never done anything. They have one name, and that's all you're checking. Typically, that's going to be a lot less expensive than someone that's perhaps moved all over the country or the world, where you have to check a bunch of different jurisdictions. Perhaps they have more than one name, a bunch of different names. So realistically speaking, criminal background checks could be as little as 30, 40, 50 bucks, or as much as, I've seen it in the thousands, where on certain matters where there's been individuals who have perhaps had a checkered past, they have a bunch of different names, lived in a bunch of different locations, and that, the criminal checks have cost thousands of dollars, literally. So it's a wide range, but that's something that you should talk to whomever you're dealing with ahead of time to understand the specs, to understand what they're getting back, and why it costs what it costs.
Yeah, I think that's pretty interesting, because when I first started seeing the numbers of how much things cost, initially I thought it was actually fairly inexpensive for what we can give, our consumer. And it depends, but I have seen that where it can get costly as more information is needed, as we dig deeper, as more names are added to the list. But overall, I thought it was fairly inexpensive. I
Yep,
thought it would be much higher.
sure.
So can you tell me why it's important that people understand all these different aspects of a criminal background check?
Yeah, I think the single most important point, Joe, is that there are differences, right? So people sort of put a criminal background check sort of in a basket as though there is no differences, right? I need a criminal background check on someone, right? And they think, again, like I mentioned earlier, we just punch in a social security number, which actually has very little to do with this, and we get records back. And it's just simply not like that. And I think a more educated consumer is going to be a better consumer. And then the decisions that they would make would be a more informed one, because they could then inform their internal folks about, again, what they're getting back, how they're getting it back, why it costs what it costs, and things like that, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And I like that how we broke this down here today, because it kind of answers all the questions that I kind of had coming into the private sector. So I'm sure it will be helpful to others.
That's the idea. A lot of people know, there's people that know everything that we talked about today. There's people that know parts of what we talked about today, and there's people that know none of this. And I think that, again, it's important that the marketplace is informed about what it is that they're getting, so that they can make proper decisions.
Sounds good. I want to thank you for answering my questions.
Absolutely. So typically we end the episode with takeaways. And again, today is one of those. It's a short episode, and I look at this whole show as a takeaway. But again, just stressing the point that I made about understanding, ask questions, talk with your partner and your background screening partner, because I think the more you understand, the better it will be for all involved. So I'd say as sort of a broad takeaway, that's my takeaway. Not sure if you have any.
No, I think you covered it. I'm glad that we did this type of show today because I think it adds value to not just our company, but for those who are questioning whether they should move forward with getting these checks done.
Sure, sure. No, I agree with you. So thank you all again for joining us. Please subscribe, please comment. Thank you for the continued feedback. We're just thrilled with the way that this is going, and excited about continuing to do it as we go forward. So if you have any questions, please email us at info@integrusintel.com. Otherwise, till the next episode, talk to you soon. Thank you, Jo, again for joining for this episode.
Of course. Take care, everyone. Don't forget to follow us. We are on LinkedIn and Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube.